And now we're on Daf Ayin Beis Amid Beis. What is the suffix of Rav Huna? After all, he paskins like Rav Yossi. That's Manashal Shtar Mochiach Alav. The suffix is the Omer Rav Yossi Balpeh, even in a case of Balpeh, Ilo Omer. Let's explain what goes on over here. Zmano shel shtar mochiach alav could be understood in one of two ways. And these are two valid possible interpretations of Rabbi Yossi's sheet. One way, and now I'm going to take the lechumra way, is to say that zmano shel shtar mochiach alav, if the issue regarding his intention is in the gufo shel get. What do I mean? In the get, it says imat. And then we look at the top of the get, and it says the date on the top of the get. So both the date and the t'nai are in the gufa get. They're in the script of the shtar. Then we take a look at imati, and we vacillate. Then we quote the top of the get, Zmano, to interpret what imati means. And we add the word me'ayom. Again, we're not actually adding the word me'ayom into the gufa get. So that's one way of interpreting Rabbi Yossi. In this interpretation of Rabbi Yossi, why do I call it l'chumra? If the words imati did not appear in the get at all, they were only verbally communicated to the Isha at the time of the Nesinas HaGet. So the Edom hear him say imati. He did not add the word me'ayom. Zmano shel shtar, but zmano shel shtar could only serve as an impact or a commentary on imati if the imati is written in the get. But if the imati was a verbal oral statement, a declaration outside of the get, then there's no tziruf, there's no interplay or interface between the t'nai that was balpeh and what he wrote, the zman in the get. O dilma, or should we say no, lekula, that Rabbi Yossi's principle of zman shtar mochiach lov applies even in the case of a t'nai balpeh. And although you might wonder why in the t'nai balpeh did he leave out the word me'ayom and he simply say imati, which implies after I die, the answer is he relied on the shtar, on the gufo shel get, the script of the get where the zman is there. Rav Huna vacillates about Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi, did Rabbi Yossi say his principle of zman shel shtar mochiach even in the case of alpeh, where he says imati, but he didn't write it in the shtar? Or alternatively, dafka lo omar, Rabbi Yossi did not apply zman shel shtar mochiach lov unless the imati is written in the get. If it's written in the get, then we have a valid siruf to join together the imati in the get tonight, together with the zman shel shtar, and the zman shel shtar reflects and interprets as a biur on the imati, adding the word me'ayom. And therefore, a maisa, if a person gives a get to his wife imati, which means balpeh, he declared imati, then Rav Huna is going to be in a dilemma, in a suffix. He's going to vacillate back and forth whether Rabbi Yossi's principle of zmano shel shtar mochiach lov applies even in a t'nai balpeh, and therefore Rav Huna is going to require chalitza and prohibit yibum because we're in a suffix situation. The Gemara rejects it. Umi misafkali, does Rav Huna actually have such a suffix? V'tanan, we have a Mishnah later on in Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis. If a man gives a get to his wife and he says to her, again, I'm adding those words, he says to her, it was not written in the shtar. It's a t'nai balpeh. If I don't show up in the next 12 months, then the get should be chal umeis b'tok 12 chodesh. And he dies before the end of the 12 months, which means that the get could only be chal after death. And ein get liachar misa, since he died before the zman of 12 months elapsed. Vitani Allah, and we have a brisa that comes to interpret that Mishnah and says, Rabbo Seinu, our rabbis disagree with the Mishnah. And they say she's allowed to get married even though he died before the 12 months. The Amrina, and we interpret what we ask the question, who are these Chachamim that were matir her in a case of Harei Zeh Gittin and Lobosim Mikan 12 Chodesh who mes b'toch 12 Chodesh. It's that Bezdin that never accepted within the context of all the Isurei Akum, like Bishal Akum and like Pas Akum. They never accepted the Gezerah of Shemen Akum, and were allowed to buy oil that's produced by the Goyim. And that's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his Bezdin. And why did Rabbi Yehuda Nasi permit her to get married based on this get al Tanai? After all, it should be a case of get lacham misa. The answer is Samri Lei. The Bezdin Rabbi Yehuda Nasi accepted Rabbi Yossi the Omer Zmana Shel Shtar Mochiach Olav. And we see clearly here that Zmana Shel Shtar Mochiach Olav applies even though the Tanai was verbally formulated and it was external to the Guf HaGet. So we see that Zmana Shel Shtar Mochiach Olav will interpret his Tanai Bal Peh, and we're adding the word Me'ayom. And in this case, what we're saying is that after 12 months, the get should be Chal Limafreya. So even though he died within the 12-month period, nevertheless, it's a get Michayim and not a get Lacham Bisa. And clearly we see that even in a Tanai Bal Peh, which was not written in the Guf HaGet, nevertheless, we're not going to say that the Tanai is Mavatal the get, but rather we're going to activate the Hochacha, the proof positive of Rabbi Yossi of Zmana Shel Shtar Mochiach Olav. The Gemara answers, Ela Mesafka Lei, what was Rav Huna's vacillation? He aloch Rabbi Yossi, even in a case of Alpeh, Ein alocha, we don't pass like Rabbi Yossi, unless the Imati was written in the script of the Shtar. Is there really a suffix? And Rav Huna doesn't know whether we paskin and accept Rabbi Yossi even lakula when the Tanai of Imati was said orally, it was not included in the Guf HaGet. V'amar Rava hareze yitech Imati shani mati. In any of these two lashonos, we see clearly that he wants to get to Bichal now, and what he said in Mati is only a Tanai, or Shani Meis is only a Tanai. So it's not a case of get lachar misa. But if, on the other hand, he says kish when I die, or uli achar misa after I die, then he wants to get to Bichal after his death. He ain't get lachar misa. Ain't a get. Hechidon. In what case did Rava formulate this principle of halacha that in Mati harei zeget? If he said me'ayom imati, that's explicit in that Mishnah. Hatnan, the Mishnah says explicitly me'ayom imati harei zeget. I don't need Rava to tell me that the get is valid if he added the word me'ayom. The elalav, therefore, by process of elimination, to make a chiddush out of Rava, the law of me'ayom. No, if he didn't say me'ayom and he said she imati or shani meis, then clearly it's a get liachar misa. How could Rava validate the get? And the answer is that even though he didn't say the word me'ayom, kirab Yossi, because mano shel shtar mochiach olav. So we see clearly that Rava says haloch kirab Yossi, and this man is mochiach, even though the Tanai was a Tanai Bal Peh, was not incorporated into the guf of the script of the get. Okay, very nice. That's Rava. But we're talking about Rav Huna. L'Rava Pshita, Rav Huna Misafko. Ibai Seim, another way of explaining. Rav Huna is that that we're talking about a case where he added the word me'ayom in mat. Ukerabanan. Then you'll ask me, well, that's just a repetition of what we saw in the Mishnah. Why did Rav bother telling me that? Hani lishni itzrichle. The Reisha is just a segue into the Sefer. The Chiddush lies in the Sefer. Shani meis or ki'im mati domi. That if he says she'ani meis, that's indicating that the get should be chal today, and im mati and shani met indicates a t'nai, but there's a built-in me'ayom, and the lashon lichsha amos is kiliacham misa dami. Okay, this ends our discussion about Rav Huna in the first transmission of Rav Huna. There could be a second transmission of Rav Huna, but in this first Lishna Kama of Rav Huna was making a comment on the Reish of our Mishnah when he said Areze Gittin Mati, and Rav Huna said that according to Rav Yossi, who holds Manash Shtar Mochiach Love, it's a Safek Gerish. But Ika Demasli Sefer, we have a variant transmission of Rav Huna. Rav Huna's statement of Safek Gerishin Choletz V'Lo Yabeves would be attached to the Sefer. If he says that this get should be chal after Misa, it's not valid and get lachar Misa. Rav Huna b'ledivri Rav Yossi choletzes v'lo misyaberes. According to Rav Yossi, we have a real suffix here because on the one hand he said segiti lachar Misa. On the other hand he said, and he didn't say be'ayom. On the other hand, zman el shel shtar mochiach olav, and therefore since we have a suffix, we don't know whether the liachar Misa is a t'nai. And in the light of the Zman on the get, we should say it's only a Tanai, and he wants the get to be Chal Me'ayom, or should we say, no, it's a Chazara? And even if he said Me'ayom, but now he says Liachar Misa, what's the language of Liachar Misa? Right, he says it Liachar Misa. So the Gemara asks the following question, Pshita. For sure, I know that according to Rav Yossi, the din in this case would be choletzes v'lo misyabemes. Why? Because Midas Seif l'Rabbanan choletzes is Reisha Nami l'Rav Yossi choletzes. The Mishnah only records the machlokes in the Sefer, where according to the opinion of the Chacham, when he says explicitly Me'ayom Lachar Misa, even though he added the word Me'ayom, we're afraid that maybe he was Choser Bo when he said Liachar Misa, and therefore it's a Safek Get and Choletz V'lo Misyabemes. And therefore Reisha Nami, in the case of the Reisha of our Mishnah, when he says Hareze Gitech Liachar Misa, and he doesn't add the word Me'ayom, is the Rav Yossi holds Gito, Zman Shel Shtar Mochiach Olav. It's as if he said Me'ayom Liachar Misa, and that would again generate a suffix, like we saw in the Sefer according to Rabbanon, and therefore let's spell Misyabemes. So once again, what's the chiddush of Rav Huda in the Shita of Rav Yossi? It's quite clear that Rav Yossi holds that in the case of Areze Gitech Lachar Misa, since we apply the principle of get of Zmano Shel Shtar Mochiach Alav, it's as if he said Me'ayom Liachar Misa, therefore we have a suffix. And the Gemara answers Ma'od Tema, if not for Rav Huna. I would have said Rav Yossi, Rebbe Svirale. Maybe Rav Yossi accepts the Shita of Rebbe. The Omar Rebbe Shita was that in Me'ayom Liachar Misa Gita Ma'al Yahavi. He's not willing, Rebbe, to accept that there is a possibility that he was Choser Bo. And even though he started with Me'ayom, he adds Liachar Misa as a Chazor. No. Rebbe rejects that. Chalitza nami lo boy, loti boy, that's an absolute valid, 100% certain get. And why is that? Because after he adds the word me'ayom, the liachar misa is only a t'nai. Kamash Malon, Rav Huna wants to tell me, no. The lo Rebbe, Savar Rav Yossi, the lo Rav Yossi, Savar Rebbe. Which means what? Rebbe lo Savar Rav Yossi. We're going to see that Rebbe holds that Me'ayom Lachar Misa is because he added the word Me'ayom. Therefore, the get is valid. But had he omitted the word me'ayom, lim'ute Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi rejects the shita of Rabbi Yossi of Zman Shel Shtar Mochiach. Because Rabbi Yossi would say, even though he omitted the word me'ayom, the get is chalim afreya because Zman Shel Shtar Mochiach. And we're going to see in the brisa that the Gemara is going to quote later that Rebbe rejected Rabbi Yossi's principle of Zman Shel Shtar Mochiach. Rabbi Yossi lo savar Rebbe. And Rabbi Yossi, as we'll see in the brisa later on, in a Tanai Beget, rejects Rebbe. Dikatani, it says later on, kozeh get. And the words kozeh get, which we'll see in a minute, is lim'ute the Rebbe, is coming to exclude the sheet of Rebbe. When Rebbe says that me'ayom le'achar misa is a Tanai and it's a vada get, but rather it's like the sheet of the Chacham that's a safek Tanai, safek chazor, and choletzes lo misyaberes. Rebbe, where do we see that Rebbe rejects Rabbi Yossi? Desanya me'ayom le'achar misa get feino get. The brisa records the first sheet of the Tanakama and the Divrei Chachamim that it's a safek gerushin. Why? Because on the one hand he said me'ayom, and on the other he said le'achar misa, and maybe it's a trai, maybe it's a chazara. But Rebbe, Omer, because they get in this case, it's a vada get. Why? Because le'achar misa is only a tnai. It's not a chazara. And we go back to the word me'ayom. Just 1 second. Okay, we'll explain in just a minute. We'll explain the diuk of the Gemara, how the Gemara knows that Rebbe rejects Rabbi Yossi. And Rabbi Yossi, where do you see that Rabbi Yossi said, because ze get la fuke mi Rebbe? This nan, we have a Mishnah later on in Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis. The Baal said to his shliach, Kisvu utnu get li ishti im lo basi. If I don't return, mikan riat shnei masar chodesh in the next 12 months. Because vua besoch shnei masar chodesh. And the shluchim did not wait until the 12-month period lapsed, but they wrote the get now. Unisano liachar shnei masar chodesh. They only delivered the get to the ish after 12 months. Eino get. The Tanakama holds that when he says to the shluchim, kisvu tnu get li ishti, he meant to commission them to write the get after the 12 months when he doesn't return. And they went ahead and wrote the get within the 12-month period. And there's no tzivya Baal, and it's against the will of the Baal, and therefore it's lo lishma, it's not a valid get. And Rabbi Yossi disagrees, and he says, because they get. Why? Because the Baal started with the words kisvu utnu, and then he said im lo basa. It means that his intention was that they should write the get now and deliver the get after 12 months if he doesn't show up. But if he had said im lo basi mikan v'ad shnei masar chodesh kisvu utnu, then even Rabbi Yossi would concede that the get is invalid. Okay, now let's see what the kozeh get means for Rebbe and the kozeh get means for Rabbi Yossi. So the word kozeh, we will emphasize, is like a mute, as if to say dafka, only in this case. Rebbe is saying kozeh get in the case in the brisa of mehayom uliachar misa. It's only because in the verbal declaration he added the word mehayom. And that's lafuke Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi doesn't require a verbal statement of mehayom. Even though he left out the word me'ayom, we're going to use and supply the word me'ayom from Zman Shel Shtar Mochiach. And Rabbi Yossi, who said kozeh get, he's also coming with the word kozeh to exclude, in this case to exclude Rebbe's Shita. Rebbe's Shita holds that me'ayom uliachar misa is a t'nai, and therefore we go basa the word me'ayom, and therefore it's a vada get. But here comes along Rabbi Yossi, he says, "Cause zeget, I only accept a suffix get in this case because we don't know, like the Rabbanan say, whether or not it's a t'nai or it's a chazara." So that Rabbi Yossi is only validating the get in the case where he said kisvu utnu before he said imlo basi mikad shnei masar chodesh. But he's coming lafuke Rebbe Shita that there's a vada get in the case where he says me'ayom uliachar misa. And now we get back to the sefer of our Mishnah. So the Mishnah says we evaluate, did he die as a result of the first choli or not? If he did not, then the get is not valid. Rav Huna, the Gemara is going to now quote Rav Huna and ask a kasha on Rav Huna from our Mishnah. Rav Huna is talking about a shchimira. And matnas chimera is gito kimatnoso. There's an equation between get and maton. Ma matnoso, if a man is a chimera and he gave his possessions away because he was ill, is him omad choser, if he survives it and has a miraculous recoupment, recoup. So the Gemara says about Basra Kufnun Alpha and Beis that he only gave this matana as a shchimer al das sheyomus, and therefore for Omad Choser he can negate and invalidate the matana because he's healthy. He only gave it because he thought he would die. Is Af Gito, says Rav Huna, we have an analogy to get. A man gave a get to his wife because he was ill and he didn't want her to fall for Yibum. Im Amad, if he had a miraculous recovery, Chozerbo. Now here the Rishonim go to town. What does it mean, Chozerbo? And they point out that it really means Batel Mi'elov, even if Lo Chozerbo. The get is Batel. Why? Because he gave it Masmach Choli and Amad. Now, Rav Huna is going to derive a conclusion in Matana from the law of get. Uma get. If a man gives a get and he's a shchimer afal gavdlo porish, he didn't say. Tnu, came into Yomer Ksuva, if all he said was Ksuva, we say that he was in Pachad Misa, and therefore he didn't add the word Tnu. Afal gavdlo mer Tnu is Afmat Noso. So too in the case of Shchimera, we're going to go with the same approach. Came on the Omer Tnu. I forgot the Lomar Konumine. Where's the Kenyan? He only said, I want you to give my property to so-and-so. But the answer is, you don't need a Kenyan. Frek the Gemara Tnan. Let's ask a kasha from our Mishnah on Rav Huna. So we need an umdana. It's not enough that he was omed v'holach b'shuk. We have to evaluate him. Machmas choli rishon mes hariza get him low. Is a no get. If you're telling me, according to Rav Huna, that in the case of a shchimira who gives a get him omad choser, the very fact that he was nisrapi micholi had a miraculous recovery. That is an automatic bittul I get. Who cares whether he died machmas choli or not? Hare Oman. And he gave the get, according to Rav Huna, with the intention, with the meaning that the get should be chal if he dies in this state of choli, but if he's omed, then he doesn't want the get to be chal. And here we have a long discussion of the Ramban. The Ramban says, I don't get it. This kasha, the Gemara, has nothing to do with Rav Huna. even Dalmiachi, if you drop Rav Huna, Yesh Lakshos b'Pashtus. How do I understand b'Pashtus? He gave the get, and he gave it machmas misa. And basically, he's saying Yemati, and he was Omer Bicholyo, he didn't die. So Lotus Kaima Tanakh. Why should it be Choser? Forget about Rav Huna. Says the Ramban that if not for Rav Huna, we can understand the Mishnah, and we'll say the following. The get of a shkimira has the same status as a matana of shkimira. I'm sorry. Without Rav Huna, the get of a shkimira does not have the same status as a matna shkimira. And matna shkimira, immediately when he gets healthy and he walks around the shuk, the matana is bata. And even if he did not recover completely, didn't have 100% of recovery, the matana is hikno ba'mira bi'alma, is a kinyan that's chal based on amira. And therefore, the nosei matana has a right to be choser bo whenever he wants to. But in the case of a get, he gave a nesina gemura to the hands of the isha, and that's not batel, unless he was omed legamri micholya. So everything makes sense here in the Mishnah why we need an umdana if not for Rav Huna. But since Rav Huna said that we should equate the din of get to the din of matana, therefore, just like in the case of matanim, omed micholya v'halach b'shuk, is even though he dies later on from the original machla, the matana is batel, because in the case of matana he has a right to be mavatel. So too in the case of get, im omed micholya v'halach b'shuk, is batel gito, even if he'll die eventually from the original machla. So that's the Gemara's kasha. Why do we need an umdana? He was omed micholya, and just like in the case of matana, according to Rav Huna, we have an equation to get that omad is mevatel. Why do we need umdana? Amar of Mar Pareder of Yosef Mishmei the Rava Nitak Michol Michol. He never really had a full recovery from his original illness. He now falls illness with a second illness. And now the question is whether this second illness is a result of his original illness. And when he dies, did he die because of his original illness, which he never had a full recovery from that illness, or did he die because of the second illness? And for that, we need a scientific medical evaluation. In fact, the Gemara of Amad K'tanim, how can you tell me that he didn't have a complete recovery? It says Amad. Mashma Amad Micholyo v'nisrapet. And the Gemara answers, Amad Micholi zev and afal l'choli achet. What it means is that it looks like, but we don't know for sure, that his original illness was cured, and now he fell ill with a second illness, but we're not sure about it, because he never had a full recovery from his first illness. Frek the Gemara of Holach Bashuk Tani. Holach Bashuk indicates that he had a complete recovery, because he was nisrape to the point of holach b'shuk. He doesn't need a cane. And the Gemara answers no. When it says holach b'shuk, it doesn't mean holach b'shuk without a mishenes, but rather holach al mishanta. He leans on his cane. And therefore, it's a case of nafal micholi lecholi, but he still has a residue of his original choli. And here we turn to Dafayim Gimel. The Hakamashmalon, the Mishnah wants to tell us a chidush that even though Amad Volach al Mishanto, leave out the word even, that because he was Holech but Dafka al Mishanto, Therefore, we don't know if he had a full recovery. And when he dies from the second machlo, we have to evaluate, did he die as a result of the first machlo? But either if he was walking on 2 feet without a mishenes, is umdana nami lo boy. We don't even need an umdana. We're going to assume that for sure he died from the second choli, and there was never a kiyum tonight, and the get is not chal, because he was completely nitak mi choli rishon. Gemara says, Shmami Noah, according to Rav, we could be daik from our Mishnah that Shchid Meira, who gave him matana to us, even though nitak mi choli lecholi, and he died from the second choli, matnaso matana, he cannot be choser, because according to Rav Huna, the din of get Shchid Meira is derived by equation for the din of matana, and in both cases, im amad choser. So since it says in our Mishnah that with regard to get, if he was nitak micholi lecholi, that's not considered as aman micholi, and therefore his get is valid because he was nitak micholi micholi. Now we're going to prove that even with regard to matna shchimera, his matana is valid in this situation of nitak micholi lecholi. And even though our Mishnah requires an umdana to determine that he in fact died from the first choli, that's only because he declared when he gave the get to his wife, im mati mi choli zeh. But if he didn't say so, then his get and his matana would be valid even without umdana. And the Gemara says, you're right, that is a valid deduction, and that halacha is correct. Just like we were medayik from our Mishnah that when he was nitak micholi lechole, he cannot be choserbo, and the matana is chal. And why is the matana chal? Because just like in get, in a case of nitak micholi, the get is chal because we assume that he was never totally cured from the first disease, so too the same halacha applies in the case of matana. Okay, then this is where we'll stop for today.